So, welcome to Energy Work, understanding how to work with energy. What I'm going to be trying to do is explaining sort of a foundation for a belief system to work with energy. I used to work in Western medicine, and then I was told that with the chronic pain that I had, I was going to be in the... So, I was in the Navy as a corpsman. Hello. Goodbye. And I specialized in behavioral health. So I worked on an inpatient psych unit for 5 years. During that time, I had years of chronic pain in my feet, knees, hips, and back. And then I developed panic attack disorder and anxiety and depression. And when I got out, doctors told me that I would need surgery and I'd be on pills the rest of my life. So I heard, as many of us here, people recovering from pretty dramatic conditions and situations, and I always thought, if somebody can do it, why can't I? So I started looking into Eastern medicine, and then it led to just a wormhole of information. Every time I came to a question, I looked for an answer, and it led to sacred geometry and a new perspective on human history. So I'm going to be trying to explain my understanding and perspective on energy, and then a new view on human history, or a different view, maybe not new. So as I came through the questions that I had, it kept challenging more and more of my beliefs. So I began to understand that every belief we have is conditioned, because when we're born, we begin believing things until we learn or experience something different, and then we believe something else. And that just continues to happen, and always. That's just how it is. So, to me, developing the ability to objectively ask or question your beliefs can be very powerful. And I think it's difficult for people when they create the emotional attachment to, this is what I know and I can't be wrong. But it's okay to be wrong. It doesn't really matter. It's either you learn and grow or stay where you are. That's how I look at it. And I look at every perspective as limited. I look at our life as directed by our higher self. So that means that everything that we see and experience and feel and perceive, and everyone we meet, it's part of our lessons, and there's meaning to it. And we can learn from all of it. And just because you don't identify the lesson in the moment doesn't mean there isn't a lesson there. So we sort of need to broaden our idea of what energy is. And Albert Einstein showed us E equals mc squared, which never really meant anything to me until I started looking into this. And then understanding that the only thing on the other side of mass is energy. So mass can be completely broken down into energy, and that's all it is made of. So not only is matter condensed, slow-moving energy, it's a vibration. Our thoughts and emotions are tangible vibrations that come off of us. So a sad thought may have a lower frequency or a lower vibration than a happy thought. And they radiate off of us and through our being. When it comes to people saying that they're triggered, I don't think that triggers are bad things. I think triggers are, in a physical sense, energy that is locked within our nervous system, and it comes from trauma or uncomfortable situations. And then when that is triggered, that is you either fall further into the trigger and allow it to control you, or you take that opportunity to heal it. So, and that comes with, we'll get more into that. So Nikola Tesla said this as well. And do you guys know who Nassim Haramein is? Have you ever heard of him?
Heard the name.
So he's one of my favorite people in the whole world, and one of the biggest reasons I'm presenting this, and we'll get really into his work too. He's a great guy. So when I started getting into this, I was looking at different research, all the research I could, And the more I looked, the more this research questioned my beliefs. And this is some of the main points that helped me begin to open up my mind to more. So the 100-monkey experiment, it was done with this monkey called the Macaca fuscata. And it was an experiment conducted on the Japanese islands over 30 years. And what researchers did is they worked with one species of monkey on one island, but they observed the same species of monkey on the other islands. So they didn't interfere with the other islands, they just observed them. So what researchers did is they took a sweet potato and they would throw it in the mud for the monkeys. And the monkeys they'd like the sweet potato, but they didn't like the mud, but they didn't actually know what to do about it. So over the course of this 30-year experiment, eventually some of the baby monkeys learned that you could wash the sweet potato off, which seems simple to us, but it took the monkeys a while to figure it out. And then other baby monkeys started copying whatever baby monkey started it, and then the adults started to catch on. And it's called the 100-monkey experiment because around 100 monkeys learning to wash this sweet potato off, very rapidly all the other islands of the same species of monkey learned how to do this. And what it told researchers is that we're connected by something unseen. And what I've learned is that every species, if there's two of anything on the planet, they actually have an energetic grid around the planet supporting their consciousness. And it's geometric. And every species has one, and there's multiple layers to every species. And that's part of progression through consciousness, is accessing this higher grid. And you could view it as a sphere within a sphere. So say if you had the level 1 sphere, to progress to level 2, it would be outside. It'd be bigger and encompass more consciousness. So that's part of human growth as well, and we'll get to that. The Power of 8, it's a series of experiments done by a woman named Lynn McTaggart, and she has books on this, and these experiments of the Power of 8 are done all over the world now. And it started with learning what intention can do, what our intention is capable of. She started in auditoriums full of people, and they would have an object on stage, and everyone would send the same thought to the object. And it could be raise the pH of the water, and everyone would send it for a certain amount of time, the same exact thought or intention to the object. And then there would be tangible changes in the object. One of the ones I read about that really got me thinking, she began to encompass people on the internet. So people all over the world were included in these experiments. And one of the experiments is they had seeds, and they took pictures of the seeds, and then they planted the seeds in a lab. They brought the pictures of the seeds into the auditorium with all the people, and the people over the internet watching. Everyone sent the same intention to one of the seeds, and that was the only seed that was affected. That would be the seed that grew more out of 10 or 5, however many seeds they were using. And what I began to think is, how can our intention not only affect something, but how does it travel? So if you're across on the other side of the world and you send a thought to an object, will that thought travel all the way through the planet? Would it follow the arc of the planet, or would it manifest instantaneously in the object? And I believe that it manifests instantaneously within the object. And I'll get to why I believe that. So after she was doing these experiments in auditorium, she asked her husband that she wanted to use smaller groups. And he suggested 8 people. So she began to use groups of 8 people, and every one of these 8 people, one person would state their intention, like, my right hip hurts. And everyone would meditate and send the same intention, like it's already healed, to that person's condition or people's deafness, injury, situation, whatever it may be. and they were having tangible results within the given period, curing people's deafness, removing pain. And a woman named Dolores Cannon, and I'll be getting into some of her work as well, she says that our intention, when it's combined with another person, it isn't doubled, it doesn't add together, it multiplies, it's squared, and it becomes more powerful. And there's been a lot of research on group manifestation as far as people in an entire region meditating on peace in that region and having results, tangible results of less violence in those regions. And that also works through our unity consciousness grid, the grid that we're all connected to. There was a hospital in China named Chilel, if I'm saying that correctly, and it was an energy hospital, and they didn't use any medicine. They only used healthy food and energy and teaching people how to move energy within their own body. They had a 95%, I don't know that they're still open. I read that they were closed, and I've also read that they're still open, but they had a 95% success rate across the board from cancer, tumors, any diagnosis they had, 95% success rate. There's a video online, and it's a 3-minute video, and there's a woman on a table in a hospital, and there's an ultrasound machine next to her, and half of that screen has a picture of a tumor in her stomach. The other half is a live image of the tumor. And then they bring 3 energy doctors in, and the doctors begin to do a chant together, and in the 3 minutes you literally watch the tumor dissolve. And it's great. Well, it's one of the things that got me going here. So Greg Braden, he has a lot of research. He's done a lot of work with Gaia TV. He has a lot of books out. He's doing a lot of good. I haven't seen a ton of work from him, but I've read some and watched some. And one of his books, called Human by Design, talks about these telomeres. And telomeres are the caps on our DNA, our helix DNA strand. These caps naturally age from 80 to 120 years, and then they cease to live. Scientists have proven that you not only can stop the aging of these telomeres, but you can reverse it. And it can be as simple as your intention and beliefs, and whether that happens. And your diet, and obviously infinite other factors, but you know what I mean. So he talks about on Gaia TV, there's a soldier in the Chinese army, and this, I think it was around 1500, something like that. And he talks about us trusting the Chinese records because they've been keeping very, very detailed records for a very long time. And they had a soldier who joined the Chinese military at the age of 60, and he retired when he was 80, and he did cartography or something like that. And then the Chinese military sent him a birthday card on his 100th, 150th, and 200th birthday. And well, I don't have much more to say about that, but I mean, that goes back to, well, I'll get more into it. So one thing that changed my entire perspective is our DNA responds to our thoughts, just as water can feel emotion. And I should probably include that. There's experiments where a Japanese scientist conducted experiments with water and would put thoughts or intention into it and then freeze it and then examine it under a microscope. And it freezes different based on the intention put into it. Love it makes these beautiful geometric forms, and hate creates just messed up looking nothing. It's just a mess. So we are water, and just as the water within us hears every thought we have, so does our DNA. And Greg Braden, in his book, he's talking to his friend, and he presents the idea that we don't begin dying when we're born, we begin healing. Like this life is a chance to heal, and every day is another chance to heal further, whether it's our personal trauma or ancestral. And to me, waking up every day and your DNA thinking like, I'm healing some more today, instead of I'm dying some more today, is a dramatic shift in mindset. Bruce Lipton is another scientist who has a lot of presentations out. One of them is called Biology of Belief, and I watched it on YouTube. What he talks about is our body functions off of proteins. That's how our body moves. And there are about 120,000 different jobs or functions for these proteins. But there's actually only a little over 30,000 types of proteins in our body. And proteins are created by a string of amino acids, and these amino acids can go in any order. And the reason that there's so many proteins, so few proteins and so many jobs is because these proteins can adapt. And the only limit to their adaptation is based on our belief system. So if I think I cannot heal myself, then the proteins in my body think then I can't heal myself. But if you believe on a core level that you can, then you will. So that's just some of the research that got me going. This is about 2 years in the works, this presentation. Okay, so this is where Nassim Haramein comes in. The image on the top right is the best way to describe old physics. And when I say old physics versus new physics, Nassim Haramein presented the unified field theory. And old physics looked at that center sphere as a star. And the weight of that star would be like the weight on a center of a trampoline. And then all the planets would rotate around the edge of that trampoline, just like the sphere going around it. The problem with that is it didn't solve gravity for individual bodies like planets. So before Einstein died, he was pursuing combining the macro physics, so celestial bodies and planets and stars, with the microphysics, so the physics of atoms. And he didn't succeed before he passed away. And that's where Nassim came in. So Nassim has a movie called Black Hole, W-H-O-L-E, like the hole. And I watched it probably 5 or 6 times before I really understood it all. But he tells the story of exactly how it led him to discovering the unified field theory. So when he was 10 years old, he goes into class and his teacher draws on the board a dot. And she says, "This is dimension 0. And it doesn't exist." And then she draws a line of dots, so a line, and this is dimension 1, and it doesn't exist. And then she drew a flat plane and said, "This is dimension 2, and it doesn't exist." Dimension 3 contains volume, and that's where we begin to exist. And his first thought, little 10-year-old Nassim, is, I'm going to fail this class, because how do you have something made of nothing? Like, it didn't make sense to him. So he's just pondering this idea, and he gets on the bus that day, and he can't get it off his mind. So he goes into his mind's eye, and he just begins to float above his body. And the higher he gets, of the people in his body turn into dots, and the vehicles, as he goes higher, turn into dots. The buildings turn into dots. He goes higher, and eventually the planet turns into a dot. And then he looks around, and the stars and planets are all dots around him. So then he comes back into his body, and he begins to look at his hand, and he sees that his hand is made of dots, all these cells. Excuse me. So he shrinks down into his hand to the size of a cell, and he sees the cell is made of dots, the atoms. And so he shrinks down to an atom, and the atom's made of dots, protons and electrons. And he gets back in his body, and he thinks, I think the dot is the only thing that exists, because if you draw a circle on a piece of paper, that could show an atom or it could show a planet. It's just a perspective. So then he spent 30 years pursuing his theory mathematically. And he mathematically proved what he was pursuing, that the sphere or the dot is the main everything, really. And it just comes in different sizes, essentially. He also found that the every sphere contains two tetrahedrons within it. And that each one is electric and one is magnetic, and that's what creates the electromagnetic field that exists around everything. It also creates the middle image on the bottom is called the torus, and that looks like a donut, but it's like an energy donut, and the center point is infinitely small. And that is the energetic field that exists around everything, created by the movement of the two three-sided pyramids within it. Now, every single galaxy, so the Milky Way galaxy and every other one, contains a black hole at the center of it. And that is the center of the spiral that is the entire galaxy. The whole galaxy is spinning, just as the sun is moving through space and the planets are spiraling around it. It's just a smaller version. What he found, so he solved this mathematical equation by approaching the atom with the exact same math we used to solve the black hole, showing that the atom is just a miniature black hole, and it just changes in size. It's just a different perspective. And at the center, so that black hole in the center of every atom contains the point of singularity. And this is how energy moves from my perspective, is through the point of singularity. So just as the electron spins around the proton in the center of the atom, it disappears into the center every single time, delivering information back to the point of singularity. The point of singularity is singular. It is one space. It is like the ether, but there are infinite access points to it. So when you have a thought or intention, it doesn't travel across the room. It goes through the point of singularity and manifests within that thing. And that's how energy moves from my perspective. Now, our reality is based on mathematics and geometry. So he needed to find a structure a little more complex than two tetrahedrons or two three-sided pyramids within a sphere. And what he found was the bottom right image, which is called a 64 tetrahedron grid. What this shape does is it's able to geometrically be built within itself and on top of itself. And the only thing it needs is itself. Something that can be built within itself and on top of itself has what is called a fractal condition. So it can fractal bigger and it can fractal smaller. And that's a huge part of the unified field theory, not mathematically just solving the atom and the black hole, but geometrically finding their exact same structure. And that's what that grid is. So if you notice, this grid is made completely of straight lines, and it's three-dimensional. If you hold a light over it, it creates the shape underneath it, which is the flower of life. So that's a two-dimensional structure made completely of curved lines. And the technique of holding a light over a structure like that is called shadowing. And this is how the ancients passed information down. And this is also why the flower of life is found on all of our ancient civilizations, because they had this knowledge, and we'll be getting into that as well. So everything goes through cycles and everything is spinning. We are spinning around the planet, and the sun is going through its own cycle. And the cycle is 26,000 years, and that cycle is called the precession of the equinoxes. So that shape, the precession of the equinoxes, it has two parts. So a light and a dark phase is one way to look at it, or a falling asleep and an awakening phase. 13,000 years ago was when Atlantis fell. And when Atlantis fell, we also fell in consciousness dramatically. About 6,500 years ago, so about another quarter way, we began waking up enough to where we could understand information. And that's when our first civilizations began appearing, Sumeria and Egypt. And now here we are, past point A on that precession of the equinoxes, on the awakening phase. We're headed back towards the center of the galaxy. And we are at the awakening of humanity. And it's just based on the precession of the equinoxes. Now, just as the sun does not sit still in space and we spin around it. The sun is flying through space and planets move around it. And when the precession of the equinoxes happen, we don't come back to the same exact place in space and in consciousness. It's more like a spring-like movement, so we're rising every time. So we've been through this several times, and when we fell, now we can rise higher than where we made it the previous time. Hopefully. I think we can do it. So the visible light spectrum, I know I'm kind of switching through a lot of stuff real quick here, but the visible light spectrum is the human visible light spectrum. So that's just what we see with our two eyes. So if you were to create the visible light spectrum in a 2-foot length, the part that we could see, the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So the visible light spectrum would only be 1/36th of an inch. So all that rest of that is still energy operating and moving through our reality. And just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. So to me, when I learned this, if you only count what you can see, then you'll be very limited. In the sense that if you were a 2-dimensional person living on a piece of paper, then trying to figure out why the line was drawn in front of you would be very confusing, because I only see the line, and that's the only thing that could be causing it, is that the line appeared, as opposed to everything else that could be causing it. Any questions?
At this point.
Okay. So, a couple slides on human history. When I began looking into this, I heard about the emerald tablets. So the emerald tablets made me start questioning things, because they defy our laws of physics, because they were created, yet their atomic structure is fixed in place. So if you dropped a bomb on these tablets, not an atom would change. It was created in a different way. And it was created by a man named Hermes Trismegistus, which it's a very important being in our history, but Trismegistus means the great, 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 or Hermes, the greatest great. And he also gave us the Hermetic principles, and he refers to himself as a being named Thoth in the emerald tablets. Thoth is depicted on the right here. That's that hieroglyph. He is the one, he's often depicted as a scribe in ancient Egypt, because he's the one that gifted writing to the Egyptians. I'll get way more into him in a minute. So he's also the one, according to Drunvalo Melchizedek's work, who built the Great Pyramid. And he built it 200 years before Atlantis fell, because they knew Atlantis was going to fall. And the Great Pyramid is the North Pole of the next level grid to support mankind's advancement. So there's an artificial grid created around the planet that's supported by 83,000 structures around the planet. And those all lay on ley lines. And that's why we see so many cultures with similar architecture, yet they had no contact, according to us. Now, the Great Pyramid is confusing to us in many ways. Excuse me. It had 2.3 million, it's made of 2.3 million blocks that weigh more than 2,000 pounds each, and they didn't come from the Giza Plateau where the Great Pyramid is located. They were moved. The old theory is that they had 20,000 people working for 20 years building the Great Pyramids, but the Egyptians were very sophisticated. They documented every single thing they did, the way they washed clothes, the way they ate, everything. But there's not a single hieroglyph depicting the construction of the Great Pyramids. The foundation of the Great Pyramid is 13 acres, and the center point on the top of the pyramid is less than an inch off of dead center on the pyramid, and it hasn't moved at all. It's sank a little, and the land has moved a little, but the actual structure and foundation has not moved. We couldn't even come close to doing that today with our technology, not even close. So then the Sphinx it has erosion marks on the back, and different scientists outside of Egypt have looked into these, and there's a lot of research into it. But the erosion marks are 12 feet deep, and scientists said for those to be created, it would have had to have rained for 1,000 years, 24/7, torrential downpour. The problem with that is our current history says that the Sphinx is 6,000 years old, but the Giza Plateau has been a desert for 6,000 years. They don't believe it rained for 1,000 years straight, so it's agreed that the Sphinx is between 10 to 15,000 years old. And that fact alone will change many aspects of our society. And so I talked about the sacred sites. They lay on geometric grid points on the planet, and there's a lot of research into this as well. And the Great Pyramid is the North Pole, and there's an island called the Island of Morea that is the South Pole. And if you're interested, we could go way into that, but there's a lot of other resources, so I'll try and leave that out. So Lemuria was a continent that it was a water continent, just thousands of islands very close together. And humanity lived there before Atlantis. Now, when there's a pole shift on the planet, continents rise and fall. That doesn't mean all of them. It's like when Atlantis sank, it sank. And I believe when Lemuria sank was when Atlantis rose. But I don't know the timelines for sure because I wasn't there. Now, Easter Island to Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean is where Lemuria existed. Now, the biology on Hawaii, from insects to microbiology, is the same as Easter Island. Now, the only possible way that can happen on an island is if it's connected to the other island at some point. So it didn't make sense to scientists. But then they began to look at coral that existed between the two. Coral can only grow down to 150 feet below the surface of the water. They found dead coral between these islands more than 2,000 feet below the surface, showing that the ocean floor rises and falls. Any questions? Okay. So the Sumerian tablets, we began finding them around 1850. We found more than 500,000 of them. Some of them contain information that's more than 450,000 years old. The Bible story is written on these they use a language, the oldest written language called cuneiform. And the story of the Bible is written down 2,000 years earlier than our current Bible. And, well, I'm not going to get super into the Bible. But in the Bible it also refers to, it talks about the God being multiple beings. And it also, when it speaks of the Garden of Eden, it says God could not find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But God is everywhere, so why couldn't he find them? Now, these came from Sumeria. Sumerian Egypt are our oldest civilizations. And Sumeria started their civilization day one with the information that the earth has a wobble. To understand that and learn that, it takes 2,000 years of continuously observing the night sky. And according to our history so far, we were bush people, and then all of a sudden we were an advanced civilization. So scientists don't really know what to do with that information. Excuse me. Now, Sumeria and Egypt, are also placed in a category called stair-step evolution. And scientists, no other culture is placed in this, and scientists have not known what to do with this information. But what it was is seemingly overnight, Sumeria gained all the knowledge of a perfect writing system. So they had a perfect writing system all of a sudden. And then over the next couple hundred years, it decreased in sophistication. So then all of a sudden they would have another jump in knowledge. They'd know everything about water systems and aqueducts, and that would decrease in sophistication. And then gears, and that would just keep going. And the explanation for this is these ascended masters, like the being of Thoth, they're beings that have learned to ascend to the next level of consciousness, but remain with humanity to help us, because we've had our issues. So the ascended masters would see someone that was ready to learn what they were ready to teach. So they would appear just in a physical body, teach them, and then they just go away. And they just kept doing this to help speed up our progression in consciousness, which is also why these 83,000 sacred sites were created, to help speed up our progression in consciousness. We're moving very rapidly for traditionally how a planet and species moves. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that's written down in the cuneiform tablets. In there, and this is just an opinion right here, but Gilgamesh is a king, I believe, and he goes on a journey with his friend, and they have to fight this troll or being that lives in the woods, and it's depicted as that tall, the picture on the right, the being like this. His name is Humbaba. Now, I find this really interesting. I went to Egypt in January, and at the temple of Isis, which is the divine feminine temple, I took the picture on the left, which it appears to be the same type of being to me. So I've just spent a lot of time thinking about that. All right. Now, we talked about Hermes as being Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, passing on the Hermetic principles. Now, science has agreed with many of these, and with Nassim Haramein's theory, they agree with principle 1 as well, and there's 7 of them. So principle 1 is the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. So what this says is that energy in our material universe is made of spirit, and spirit, or the all, is unknowable and undefinable, but can be considered an infinite living mind. And because of that, everything exists within the mind of the all as a mental projection. Therefore, energy, force, and matter are all subordinate to mastery of mind. And that's why we go in instead of trying to conquer out. Just so you know, when I was studying these, I would have to take a nap after trying to study these. So I know it can be a lot of information. So principle 2, the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above. So this embodies the truth that there is correspondence between the laws and phenomenon of the various planes of being and life. And just as man uses the principles of geometry to calculate star movements and distances while seated in his observatory, this allows man to intelligently reason from the known to the unknown. And he says, study the nomad, understand the archangel. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that last part too. Principle 3 is principle of vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. So energy, matter, mind, and spirit all vibrate. Pure spirit is vibrating at such an intense speed and infinite rate of rapidity that it appears to be at rest, just as a moving wheel appears to be motionless. On the other end of the spectrum is gross matter, which is vibrating so slowly that it appears to be at rest. And there are millions upon millions of varying degrees between those two. Now, the planes of energy and force vibrate, the spiritual planes vibrate, and the mental planes vibrate. And the vibration of your mental body determines the mental plane that you can perceive. And that's what raising your vibration is, to help perceive these higher planes. Principle 4, the principle of polarity. So everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet and all paradoxes may be reconciled. So this says that everything has two poles or opposite aspects. But opposites are extremes of the same thing with varying degrees between them. So if you look at a thermometer and you try and find where hot begins and cold ends, there is no defined line. It's actually determined by your perspective. So hot and cold to us is a manifestation of what we call temperature. And it's simply a different form, rate, and variety of vibration. It's just a different vibration. Now the mental planes vibrate as well, and we have poles that exist in the same way. And if we take love and hate, for example, they seem to be completely opposites, but towards the middle we have like and dislike. And sometimes we aren't even sure what we feel. The reason this part is taught is when you can identify the emotion you're feeling and understand that you're just on the same scale of a positive emotion, you can flip yourself to that. And that is part of mental alchemy, learning to control yourself mentally. Only a few more. So the principle of rhythm. So everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in all things. The measure of the swing to the left is the measure of the swing to the right, because rhythm compensates. So this states that there is an ebb and flow between the two poles described in the principle of polarity. There's always an action and a reaction, a rising and a sinking, and this is true in all affairs of the universe, of suns, of worlds, men, animal, mind, matter, and energy. Everything has its ebb and flow. This is true in the creation and destruction of worlds, the rise and fall of nations, the life of all things, and in the mental states of man. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but someone who practices the Hermetic principles has often been referred to as a Hermetist. So essentially what that is using these to understand the self better. And the principle of rhythm is understanding that when you're flowing, you will ebb. And the further you understand yourself, the more you understand when you're going to ebb, and you can rest at the point of neutrality instead of going into your ebb fully. So you can't completely negate your ebb, but you can compensate it to a certain degree. Principle 6, principle of cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law unrecognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. So there's no such thing as chance. There are many planes of cause and effect, and the higher dominate the lower, but nothing can escape the law. So again, referring to a Hermetist, what they learn to do is mentally rise above the normal plane of cause and effect to what they do is they cause on the higher planes to affect the lower planes, the ordinary plane of cause and effect. So they are not just the affected, but they are the causers. And I don't have a formula for it at the moment, but it's part of learning, I guess. The principle of gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles, and gender manifests on all planes. So no creation, mental, physical, or spiritual, can exist without these two principles. And every one and everything contain these two elements. And I think a simple acknowledgement of that, we hear about toxic masculinity, and if people just understood we had both aspects of ourselves, they could come into balance within themselves. You can't be on an extreme. Or I guess you can, but... So interpreting the chakra systems. Now, excuse me. I look at chakra systems as only an interpretation. So we can use the harmonics of music to interpret the traditional systems, 7, 8, 12, and 13. The center shows an octave in music. And if we look at the white keys, there's 8. And if we look at all the keys, there's 13. Now, an octave is complete within itself. So it contains all the sharps and flats in the chromatic scale. Not only that, but it sort of has an optional point of view. So the top white key is actually the first note of the next octave. So if we look at just 7 white keys, it'll give us the system on the right, the 7 chakra system. And if we include the 8th, it'll give us the first chakra of our next set of chakras. And the same goes with the 12 and 13, just including the black keys. I've heard that there are up to 144,000 chakras within the body. That's not really manageable. Now, every chakra has a front and back. You could, because this is an interpretation, you could view your chakra system as a 5 system, a 3 system, or just one whole chakra. And how you interpret your energy affects how energy flows through you. And that's something I read in Drunvalo Melchizedek's work, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. And that's where the 13 system on the left, that's where that image comes from. Now, we talk about raising vibration, raising our vibration. So if we look at the colors associated with the 7 system, so again that lines up with the harmonics of music, it gives us the colors of the rainbow in order. Now the colors of the rainbow, if you take the color red and you had a 1 foot length, say red goes up and down 1 time. So it has a really long wavelength. And the higher you go, the more times that color goes up and down. So by the time you get to purple, it might go up and down 100 times in that same space. That is a way to describe energy density versus material density. So material density is more physical matter in the same amount of space. Energy density is the same thing, just more energy in the same amount of space. And that's how we raise our vibration. Now I find it really interesting that we could view our chakra system as one chakra because it gives us the color of the rainbow. We are a body of water, or like a prism, and if you shine pure white light into a prism, it creates the rainbow. And that's part of how I look at our ascension process, is having every one of our chakras functioning fully healthy to be the rainbow, or together, pure white light. Now, I am explaining all this to explain energy work, but it's not all necessary, but we'll get there. So I look at the bodies as existing in layers. So the physical exists within the emotional, and it's a sphere within a sphere, and then a larger sphere has the mental body, and then the spiritual body has a larger sphere. And now that to me is also just an interpretation, and it's a point of view of separation, because you could view the bodies as separate, but they're completely intertwined at the same time. So you could just view them as one whole sphere. And Edgar Cayce, who's known as the sleeping prophet, he says that nothing manifests within our physical body without being connected to our other bodies. We also have an astral body, our higher self, our lower self, our inner child, and a soul. I think our connection to our inner child is extremely prevalent to rising to the next octave of existence. And in Egypt, they would show 2 scales. And on one end would be the initiate, or the person who's passed away, their heart, and then the feather on the other side. And the idea of that is lightheartedness. And you can't proceed unless you have lightheartedness, which comes from a healthy inner child. So you got to dance and have fun. Like that is part of life. This experience is meant to be fun. And every chakra spins clockwise. So if the chakras on the front of our body would be like having a clock mounted on the front, the chakra on the back, so the back of the heart chakra, would be like a clock mounted on your back. Your crown would be like a clock on your head facing up, and your root chakra would be like sitting on a clock facing down. That's how they spin. We can also use the harmonics of music to interpret the dimensions in which we exist. And this comes from Drunvalo Melchizedek's work as well. So the word dimensions can be perceived in 2 different ways. The one I described earlier, Nassim Haramein was confronted with at 10 years old. Or you could use waveform physics, which is the idea that everything is vibrating and has an electromagnetic field. And then superimpose that with the harmonics of music, and then you can look at dimensions. So this drawing, this very sophisticated drawing that I drew, shows those 12 circles within the 2 voids is an octave. And that is the octave in which we exist. Now not looking at that, but actually harmonics of music, a university in California has found more than 200 overtones between every note in the harmonics of music. And the reason that happens is because the system is holographic. Just as the fractal condition can grow infinitely in and out of itself, this can go infinitely in and out of itself as well. When we're using it to interpret our dimensions, we use the 12 notes, and between every note are 12 major overtones. So that's 12 times 12, 144 dimensions that we exist in. And between every overtone and every note is a void. And that is how I look at what the veil is, how we say the veil is thin or whatever's going on. And in between the octave is a denser void, if you will, a harder void to traverse. And Drunvalo says God put those there for a certain reason. I don't have that reason right now. Now, the human light body has structure. So our physical body is a physical structure, but we have an energetic structure as well. And before Atlantis fell, this star tetrahedron, which is the same shape that Nassim Haramein found as the electromagnetic field within every sphere, mankind had this readily available. People remembered this. Now, every human alive has this around them, but it's been dormant for about 13,000 years because when we fell in consciousness, we lost our memory. From the Melchizedek point of view, immortality is actually, it has nothing to do with the physical body. It has to do with memory and remembering who we are from these other planes of existence. And Drunvalo Melchizedek even talks about he remembers who he is, and that's where we're all headed, if we choose to. In Egyptian, now it's called the MerKaBa, and in Egyptian, that word is broken down to Mer, counter-rotating field of light, Ka is spirit, and Ba is the interpretation of reality. Do you have a question? Okay, sorry. So, spirit created a counter-rotating field of light to interpret the reality. So this is a vessel that we use to experience the reality. This shape, so again, is called a star tetrahedron, and it is proportional to each person. So there's a pranic tube that runs from the top point to the bottom point through us, and it is the width of our thumb and middle finger. The edge of each of these shapes, or each edge on this shape, is the length of your fingertip to fingertip. And every point will perfectly touch the inside of a sphere. That's very important, that it fits perfectly in a sphere. Now, this image here of this person in a MerKaBa is a female. And we know it's a female because the Earth tetrahedron, so just looking at the bottom pyramid, it's pointed forward. And the Sun tetrahedron, the flat face of it is forward. Now that is the female shape. For men, the Sun tetrahedron, so the top tetrahedron, that front point is pointed forward. And then the Earth tetrahedron, the flat face is forward. When I started learning about this, because we can remember this, and Drunvalo Melchizedek has teachers all over the world that teach a course called The Awakening the Illuminated Heart. And that's the reason I came to Colorado initially, is for that course. And you can remember who you are, but there's two ways to activate your MerKaBa that I know of. And there's a mechanical way and there's an organic way. The mechanical way is a meditation breath mudra method. And it's given in Drunvalo Melchizedek's The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, Volume 2. That is mechanical because it doesn't include the heart as much. So organically activating this is connecting the unity of the heart, so the oneness of the heart, and into the polarity of the brain. So our brain has two hemispheres, so it is polarity. And this can be activated by connecting our heart to our mind, to the MerKaBa around us, and remembering. And when you go to the course and you activate your MerKaBa through your heart, Drunvalo describes it's like getting a supercomputer without having any programs on it. So it takes time we don't remember it for 13,000 years. So it takes time to remember and learn to work with it. So when I started this, to help me remember it, I took 3 lengths of rope, fingertip to fingertip, made a triangle around me with the front pointed forward as to represent the Sun tetrahedron. And then I would just sit and meditate in that and help me remember. Not that I fully remember anything, but I'm just doing my best. Okay. Now the structure of our reality. So the star tetrahedron, one of its traits is that every point perfectly touches the inside of a sphere. Now, if in sacred geometry and geometry in general we have the Platonic solids, these shapes have other characteristics. So each point touches the inside of a sphere, but they also, every face has the same number of edges. Every length on the shape is the same length, and every angle inside the shape is the same degree. And that's the requirement to be a Platonic solid. Each Platonic solid has an element and a gender associated with it, so male, female, and child. And I would just like you to note that in the child column, we have the octahedron and the sphere. And I'll bring that up in a few minutes, but just remember that they're in the same column. And void and air are kind of the same elements, just as ether and water are kind of the same elements. So the 2 lists in the top right describe male and female energy. Our left brain is our male mind, and we've been a male-minded species since we fell in consciousness. Relatively out of balance. Now, the male mind thinks logically. The female mind feels intuitively. So it's more faith-based. And a big part of me trying to present this information is this is what it took for my left brain to allow me to believe that my right brain existed, that there's things beyond that what we can see. Another thing worth noting is that male energy goes in straight lines, female energy goes in curved lines. And if we think back to that 64 tetrahedron grid, when the physics, so that was the three-dimensional shape, creating the two-dimensional curve structure, so it goes three-dimensional male to two-dimensional female. And I don't really have much to say about it, I just think about it all the time. Sequences are prevalent in nature. The binary sequence is male, and that's how our cells divide. The Fibonacci sequence is female, and that is what nature grows by. The golden mean ratio is often referred to as the perfect number, and the golden mean rectangle is it creates that curved line is a never-ending spiral, and the golden mean rectangle can be infinitely created within itself and without. So it can grow just as the fractal condition, in and out. So the Fibonacci sequence adds the previous number of the sequence as opposed to doubling. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, and so on. Now, if you take any number in the Fibonacci sequence and divide it by the immediate previous number, it will give you a ratio. And that ratio gets closer and closer to the golden mean ratio the higher you go in the sequence. And the reason it does that is because the golden mean spiral does not have a beginning or end. And nature does not know what to do with something that doesn't have a beginning. So it kind of cheats and uses the Fibonacci spiral and creates spirals in nature. So the two images on the right are from, again, Drunvalo Melchizedek's The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. And the Fibonacci spiral is given its name because of a man named Leonardo Fibonacci, who lived 250 years before Leonardo da Vinci. And he was in nature, and he noticed that plants grew like that top right image, adding the previous number of the cycle. And then the list on the bottom shows a bunch of plants that grow with Fibonacci numbers. And it's really interesting if you go in nature and if you draw a horizontal line on a tree and count how many branches it has, and then you can go up to another one, and a lot of times it follows a Fibonacci sequence. And that's what he observed. So the spiral, the bottom right image is the spiral of a galaxy. So there's a black hole in the center of that, and we're spiraling around it. There is a dark arm and a light arm that spin opposite of each other. So that dark space is not completely energy, and it can be looked at as dark energy, but dark doesn't mean bad, it's just different. It's just a part of the cycles of nature. And more times than not, if a star or planet is going to die, it happens within the dark energy spiral, as opposed to the light. Any questions? All right, so the Platonic solids come from Metatron's cube. Metatron's cube comes from the third rotation of the flower of life, which is this image on the right called the fruit of life. And I'll explain what the rotations mean in a moment. So the fruit of life structure is 13 circles that can be interpreted 13 different ways. And it gives us 13 different informational systems. The first one is the most simple because it combines male and female energy. You draw a straight line between the center of every circle to every other circle, and that creates Metatron's cube. Metatron's cube gives us all the shapes we just reviewed, all the Platonic solids, but it gives us two sets. The smaller version and the larger version. I'll come back to this slide. But this shows how there is a smaller shape within every larger shape. And that is the fractal condition Nassim Haramein was looking for. Drunvalo writes this, but it is an eternal truth that 7 circles will fit inside of any circle. Just so if you draw a circle, you can fit the center 7 circles of the fruit of life. And that will give you one set of Platonic solids. And once you have one set, you can create a set on top and within it. So this is what he was looking for. But all our ancient cultures had this information. So the flower of life, these are just some of the places that it's been found throughout the world. And it tells the process of creation through spheres, through geometry. And Drunvalo says that anything that can be said, thought of, can be explained much more thoroughly through sacred geometry. And I don't understand that thoroughly enough to explain it yet. But, and this can be difficult, but if you look at the center sphere, or the center circle on the flower of life, and the circles that touch the edge of the shape, and the center circle, there are 7 of them. And that gives us a set of the Platonic solids.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that on the temples when you were in Egypt? I know they're everywhere.
Only one place called Abydos in Egypt, which is, it's really interesting how they were carved there, because it's like laser carved into the rock.
I've seen a picture of that.
Yeah, so they carved it like they were in a rush though, and I don't understand why. Because it's like, this might get confusing, but there's like the flower of life, there's several of them, and then there's the other the other rotations. So the seed of life is there, the fruit of life, the egg of life, and they're just burned into rock randomly. It's like they were in a rush and they just needed to leave the information behind. I don't understand, but it is definitely, the tour we were on was based on Drunvalo's teaching. So we had a private ceremony in the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, and then we went through all the temples, and the temples go through the chakra system because they're meant to energetically work on our DNA and our being to help us progress in consciousness. And that's what they would call initiates, people that studied this information in ancient Egypt. They would have to work through each of these temples, conquering certain aspects of themselves until they got to where they needed to go to help humanity. So, this is why I wanted to mention the octahedron and the sphere. So spirit was just in the void, just floating in the void. And in the void, spirit couldn't move because there was nothing to move relative to. So spirit only had one option to extend itself. And what it did is it extended itself in 6 directions: up, down, left and right, and front to back. And each of those lines was equal distance. And if you connect the edge of each of those lines with a straight line, it will make an octahedron. So the first male shape. And then what spirit needed to do is it spun that shape on one of its axes to make a sphere. And that was the first combination of male and female energy, in my perspective. So the next thing it did is it moved to the edge of that sphere and created another sphere. Now, when you have 2 spheres that are the same size, they will intersect each other's centers perfectly. The middle shape, like a Venn diagram, is called the Vesica Piscis. Now, the shape is extremely important for many reasons, but it gives us not only the mathematics for how light moves, but it shows us how light moves. So if we look at this, the left image, and we look at the 2 smaller spheres that are horizontal to each other, there is a vertical line that is the length and a horizontal line that is the width. Can you see that middle shape? That is called the Vesica Piscis. The length of that shape is the electrical component. And the width, the closer part, is the magnetic component. And then this can show us how light moves, because if you take the length of that small one, it will become the width of the next movement. So if you look at the eyeball that goes around the football shape I just said, that is the new, I marked them. So the new length and the new width, which that is the best way I could explain it through drawings. It's, I'm doing my best with that one. So in the Bible, it says that God moved upon the face of the waters, and then he said, "Let there be light." And the importance with that is that the motion came before the light. So God moved to the other sphere, and then light was created. Now, the next instruction is the same instruction for the rest of the shape, and you go to the innermost point. So where I wrote new length on that shape, that is the innermost point of the two larger circles. So it could either go onto the right one or the left one and make another sphere. And it just keeps doing that, and it creates this rotation of spheres. On the fourth motion, or the fourth sphere, or the fourth day, many Bibles in the world say half of creation was completed. And that's why I drew the vertical line through it, to show that half of the seed of life shape was completed. Now, if you look at these, the seed of life shape, as three-dimensional spheres, like we're looking at the top of them, the center one would be like a planet, and then the energetic field of the torus is what the other circles represent. So this was the first creation, the torus, and this is why the torus exists around everything, which is what Nassim found, mathematically. So after this 6 circles, or 6 days, the instruction remains the same. Go to the innermost point. So any of the spots on the outer part where the circles intersect, you would draw another circle, and you just keep going around. And the seed of life is the first rotation. Going around again creates the second rotation. So you look at the center circle, and then not any of the circles from the first rotation, just the new circles of the second rotation. And this shape is a three-dimensional shape that could be perceived as a cube or a star tetrahedron. The center circle is hiding a sphere behind it, so another circle behind it, and that creates 8 circles. And this shape is called the egg of life. So when we are conceived, the sperm goes into the egg, and the tail of the sperm just it dissolves, and the sperm turns into a sphere that's exactly the same size as the egg within the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida contains the woman's egg. Now, when these two spheres intersect, it creates the Vesica Piscis. It has to, because they're the same size. So once they merge into one, they begin dividing binarily. So 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. At 8 cells, that sphere of the zona pellucida, so the mother's egg, is completely full of these 8 cells. So it fits perfectly within the sphere. The only issue with that is that these cells are gigantic compared to the average human cell. And before we leave that sphere of the mother's egg, we will divide into 512 cells within it. And at that point, we're the average size of a human cell. Drunvalo talks about these cells as, once they are energetically created, they are closer to who you are than who we are physically. And scientists have taken this shape and divided it in quarters and in half, and it creates exactly identical beings. And he also says that we don't just grow like a string bean, like we see physically, vertically up and down. We grow in a sphere. So as big as we are physically, we are contained within a sphere. And it starts with the egg of life form. The egg of life, so all the cells in our body every 5 to 7 years are replaced, but these do not go away. And they remain at the geometric center of our body, which is just above our perineum, near our root chakra. And that's what we grow out spherically from. And Drunvalo also talks about that all organic life must pass through this form, at least on Earth. Questions? Okay. So, I think it's important to understand why Spirit created the reality. And the Spirit created the reality to perceive everything from every perspective. So the goal in this life is only to experience and express. So you express yourself and you experience. And to do that, ego needed to be created. So in polarity, we needed to believe that we are separate so we could experience separation until we choose to be unified again. The path back to source. Which is, I don't believe that any religion is bad. I believe they can be weaponized, but I believe that every path to source is a good path. So ego wants to enhance its identity through association with an object. I have, therefore I am. These points come from Eckhart Tolle, mostly. I learned a lot from his book, The New Earth. So, when we have something, we unconsciously create an emotional attachment to it. And if you have an emotional attachment to it, your ego is saying that this is a part of me, and that if I lose this, I will be less of me. And I started thinking, if you have nothing, then who would you be? Because if you can't have an emotional attachment to an object, then what are you? Like, what do you stand for? And I think it's more in what you stand for and how you treat people. So you can still value and care for things without an emotional attachment. And it can be as simple as acknowledging, oh, I have an emotional attachment to this, so I've made this part of my identity. Like, my vehicle's on fire, and I'm not upset because I acknowledge my emotional attachment. It's like, okay, well, it's just a physical thing. I'm glad I'm all right. Wanting is not wrong. It is structural in our ego. Ego will always want. It doesn't want the moment. It just keeps wanting, and fulfillment is short because the wanting is never full. And that's okay. You can talk to your ego, and it's not about beating yourself up for your attachments. It's about acknowledging it so you can grow. So ego grabs identities and mental concepts of ourselves. So not only physical objects, but it can be titles, it can be identities, like I'm a fast driver and that's my identity and you can't take that away, or whatever it is. There's an ancient practice of renouncing all your possessions. And if you renounce your possessions, but you begin to think relatively unconsciously, I am above my possessions, therefore I am superior. That is the new identity that ego has grabbed onto. And these identities will never stop. It's just ego's structure and want. And it's part of our progression is just identifying when we have those identities. So when I had chronic pain, I was still working on the psych unit reading this book. And I remember the day at work, because I didn't really expect to be attacked by a book the way I did. And I had all this chronic pain. And in the book, he talks about we can grab onto our pain for sympathy from others. And it's the identity of the sufferer. And my pain didn't really make sense, and that's exactly what I was doing. I was feeding the victim within myself, and the victim will never be full. And the more you feed your victim, the more it wants, which I think pretty soon we're going to stop promoting victim culture. It's just not a good mindset. It keeps you trapped and makes you feel weak, but we are not weak. We just perceive ourselves that way sometimes. So the attachment to the body will always lead to suffering, but we are not the body. We are the awareness of the body, and we can embody being the divine observer of self. So the idea is to express your divine nature in this life, because we are all divine, and ego doesn't want to believe that. And worthiness is a huge step in that. People don't want to believe that they can be divine, but I believe everyone is possible of anything, and it's due to our divine nature. So ego is created by spirit to experience. There is no right or wrong in spirit's eyes, only free will, choices, and lessons. Our higher self is already unconditional love, and we have to embody it. So, like I was saying, polarity was created for experience. Just as spirit could not move because there's nothing to move relative to, you cannot perceive anything unless there's a perspective to perceive it from, which is why polarity exists. So there's nothing wrong with polarity, but we have to transcend it. And that starts with a practice of diffusing the egos, right or wrong, better or worse, black or white. So this is how I look at loving people unconditionally. So unconditional love is loving without attachment or expectation. You don't expect someone to change, you don't want them to be different, you just hold space, be in your divine self, loving them for however they want to express themselves. And any agenda you put on that diverts away from unconditional love. Once there's an agenda. When the agenda is only experience, it is unconditional love. Now, with the practice of that, self-love is very important too. So, boundaries, and if someone is abusing your energy, abusing you, mistreating you, you can unconditionally, just with unconditional love, put up a boundary like, hey, I love you, but I don't like you, so just you got to be over there. Like, love is not limited to hugging and kissing. I look at love as being the only thing that actually exists. So when the pure light at the first formation of the Vesica Piscis is unconditional love. Just as, so this goes back to us being a rainbow of white light. That is, once we have all that functioning, we are practicing unconditional love within this level of reality. Does that make sense? I was starting to go on a tangent there. So, ego, I look at a meditation practice of ceasing thought, because as I said earlier, our thoughts and emotions are vibrations, tangible vibrations that come off of our being. And when those relatively low vibrations are coming off of us, the vibration or frequency of our higher self is unable to get to us. But quieting the mind and practicing unconditional love is how we embody the frequency of the higher self. So awareness to the body anchors you in the present moment, and ego just does not want the present moment. It always wants something else. So a good practice for anchoring in the moment is feeling or visualizing. So if you don't ask the mind, but you just feel into your hand, and you feel the pulse in your palm, and your skin, and the blood, and your joints, and your tendons, and your fingertips. When you are not asking the mind, you are just feeling. You're not creating these vibrations off of your mind, you're just feeling. And for me, it still is sometimes really difficult to be without thought, but visualizing or feeling is a good step to that for me. Visualizing is an exercise for your pineal gland, and if you're trying to create an image as clear as we see with our two eyes in your mind's eye, it takes all of your focus, and all of your energy is going to that. And to me, that anchors you in the present moment. Because as soon as you start drifting off, the visualization goes away. At least for me. Candle gazing helps a lot. So you stare at a candle and then close your eyes and follow the dot, and then make an image around the dot. And the eye exercise, I started this on the psych unit. And all it is approaching a conversation without saying I. So like, okay, I'm not going to talk about myself. And what that allows you to do is you just feel and you hear and you listen and you respond to somebody about them instead of waiting to respond about yourself. And it's, for me, it feels like a very profound practice in diffusing the ego. And whenever you want to say I, it's your ego wanting to talk. And technically we never have to say anything. So when I worked on the psych unit, the whole job was to talk to people all the time. Homicidal, suicidal ideation. And you can really connect with someone if you're just like, oh, tell me more about this. What about this? How are you feeling about this? Instead of, well, let me tell you about my story. Which now, as you practice this and acknowledge it in your own life, remember that it's not right to judge people when you hear a conversation of, well, I did this, I did this, I did this. Because we've all been there, and it's okay, and everyone's favorite person to talk about is themselves. And that's okay. That's just how our ego is programmed. It's structural. Almost there. You guys are doing well, thank you. So, owning your power. Just as ego grabs identities, I look at the identity of spiritual as a temporary identity, just like anything else. So to me, if I say I am spiritual, which I don't say to very many people because it doesn't come across how I think about it, it only means that everything in my life has meaning, that I am willing to learn from everything I am experiencing. I am not better or worse than anyone, I'm just trying to learn from my own personal experience. So, as everything we perceive is a part of our lessons, it's also a reflection of self. And the biggest way we can learn about self is through our triggers. Now, I do not look at being triggered as a negative thing. I look at it, as I mentioned, an opportunity to heal. I'll keep going. So, this is where shadow work comes in. So, shadow work, to me, is using these lessons from the spiritual identity to identify the triggers within myself that are making me act in ways I do not want to act. Because we're completely capable of being happy and blissful within every moment. And these conditioned beliefs and these triggers within us from our traumas and experiences hold us back from that. But it doesn't have to be that way. The observer effect came from an experiment where they shot electrons through a box that nobody could see. Nobody could look in the box. And then they did the experiment where somebody was watching, observing the experiment, and it changed the experiment. And that's where the observer effect comes from. Anything that is observed is changed. So if you're able to identify through your triggers a block within yourself, then you have already started dissolving that aspect of yourself, that trauma within yourself, and healing it. Now the awareness, it's tangible light. That's your energy is electricity, it is light. And when you think of something, your energy goes there. So now there are many layers to these traumas within self, and like you may learn, oh, I reacted this way because of this childhood trauma, and I healed that. Well, it doesn't mean you healed the core of that. There are layers to it, and you have to come back to it and continuously healing. It is just another spiral of nature. It takes time and work. So unresolved trauma is a frequency we carry. So when I mentioned it at the beginning, I said that it was a block within our nervous system. But that block in the nervous system is only our physical body that anchors through our other bodies. So, so that trauma is anchored through all our bodies, and we have to learn to transmute it. So transmutation within self is a powerful practice, and it can be done by creating gratitude for the thing that triggered you or the thing that traumatized you. And we do that by identifying how we grew from it. So I know this happened to me for a reason. This is how I grew from it. I am now grateful for that trigger. And being able to have gratitude is one of the highest vibrations we can have, as opposed to our victim energy of, why did this happen to me? That's a low frequency, and it will keep us in a low frequency if we let it. It can be hard to identify where we are identifying as a victim in our life, but the sooner you can practice it and start ripping those band-aids off, we all do it. Like, why am I stuck in traffic? Why would this happen to me? Even those subtle things are victim energy, and that your DNA, your being, every level of you hears those thoughts and feels that frequency. Blaming others is another victim energy. So I do not believe in saying, even though I still do it sometimes, they made me feel this. No, I reacted that way because of the blocks within myself. And due to that trigger, I am able to heal that now. Taking the blame away from them and taking responsibility for my healing. That's part of transmutation. One thing I think about all the time is you're not obligated to react any certain way to anything, ever. And that could, happiness, sadness, there's no obligation to feel that way. So that is within self, and that's what self-esteem comes from. And we've all heard people joke about self-esteem. Well, that's about you, so why don't you feel better about you? But it takes real work. It takes time to work on yourself. And it takes a lot of compassion for self. Like, if you had a trauma as a child that seems so insignificant, but it created this core belief within yourself of all these negative thoughts about yourself, you have to have compassion. It's okay, and we've all been there. So every time, this helps me check myself all the time. If I have an emotional reaction to somebody, and again, they made me feel, I have just given them power over me. So they made me feel so they can control me in that way? No. I reacted that way because of things within myself that I'm ready to heal now. Responsibility is such a big part of our growth. And if we don't practice it, we will be held in that low frequency. Couple more. Now we're to the energy work, which this whole thing is based on. So, Edgar Cayce, again, the sleeping prophet, says everyone is psychic. And it's simply an exercise of the pineal gland and learning to work with our extrasensory perceptions, which oftentimes when someone's going through an awakening, they seem crazy because they're perceiving things that are not there. Drunvalo was a part of an experiment where they brought in over 100 different types of healers, from shamans, chi masters, Reiki masters, witches, everybody. And they measured the vibrations coming off of these energy workers. They all had the same frequency of the vibration of the heart. So our heart vibration is like the middle or the median vibration. And working through our heart is the easiest way to do energy work, from my opinion. So this is why I do not advertise that I do Reiki. I put it on my cards so people have some idea what I'm talking about, but it is only energy. And I actually don't do anything. I only channel energy. And I'll explain that as well. So this second part I learned from Dolores Cannon that changed my entire life. That life is about learning, but you must learn your lesson to pass the current grade that you're in. And if you tap out of this life, the next one, you got to get back to that same lesson. And it was actually 2 years ago this month when I learned it. And I was having panic attacks still, and just like days of panic attacks, and it was going on for a couple of years. And when I learned that, I thought, I do not care what is ahead of me. I am not going through that again. I'm not getting back to this point to make this decision. Like, this is my chance. And I worked with suicide all the time, so it was a very common thing to talk about, you know. So this also pertains to the way Drunvalo Melchizedek describes energy work. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, my knee hurts, can you work on it? Of course. And if I work on their knee, I only channel energy for their highest good. So I'm not giving my energy, I'm channeling energy to their highest good. If they have not learned the lesson from their pain, then the pain cannot be resolved. And if I try and resolve it, that's going to create karma between us that I do not want. So I don't actually do anything in an energy session. There are certain manipulations of energy I do as far as grounding, aligning, and opening energy centers and clearing the energetic field and calling back energy. But true deep healing is on the responsibility of the person, which can make it, if somebody comes up to me, can you heal this? And I'm like, you're responsible for it, let's try it. It can be it's a turn off, and it doesn't usually come across the way I mean to. So we have to take responsibility for everything we experience and give gratitude for it. And then regret is just an unlearned lesson. So if I have a regret, to me, that's my mind telling me I still have something to learn from this. And regret energy is a low frequency. And we don't have to have any regrets. We can look at, well, I learned this, so I'm glad it happened. I'm glad I did that. It might not have been right at the time for, whatever reason, but you can be grateful for it. You do not have to hang on to regret because any social obligation, anything else, you can heal those aspects within yourself. And the conscious mind is limited. So if I'm going through something and I think, this is absolutely terrible. Like, why is this happening to me? And then I think, oh, my higher self is doing this. Why would I do this to myself? Oh, I know my conscious mind is limited, and this is a part of my lessons. And oftentimes we hear that a person will not change unless they are uncomfortable. So if you were completely happy, why would you change anything? So we have to experience these things to grow to be the person we are. And if someone hurts us, I look at that as my soul was floating around, and say I need to learn forgiveness, and another soul's floating around, and I'm like, hey, can you hurt me so I can learn to forgive? And they're like, sure. And they're willing to take on that karma for me. So not only am I grateful for my own personal growth, but I'm grateful for their sacrifice. And it takes a lot of conscious acknowledgement to really embody this, but everything is a practice. Life is a practice. It is only a school. So I kind of talked about channeling energy versus using your own energy. When you channel energy, you should not be drained from doing energy work. So I imagine the chakra 1 hand length above my head as a light, a gateway to my higher self, and the pranic tube between them to my crown channels energy down through me to my heart, out my arms. And that's usually how I'm doing energy work. There's different ways, but that's a simple way. Now, if I am closer to the person, like a relative, or I really want to heal the person, unconsciously I will take on this responsibility that I need to heal them. And then I take on the frequency of their blocks, and then I'll feel that pain. So if I'm working on their shoulder and I'm like, I want to heal them so bad, I start feeling pain in my shoulder. And many energy workers that you talk to experience this at the beginning of their practice of taking on pain of clients. But to me, there are two ways to look at it. It can either be that you are taking on the pain, or you have something called a matching picture. So if there's a similar block between us that has a similar frequency, and the energy that I am channeling through me, which is completely conscious energy. Energy is just as conscious as you are, and anything else is. So if that energy works on me and I feel pain in the same way that they're feeling, it may be me taking on their pain, or it may be me being healed in another way. So there are different ways to look at it, and it's a practice, again, trying to identify these things and identifying when someone's in your energetic field, when an emotion you're feeling is from you, or if it's somebody else's. And which brings me to my next point. So these energy exercises, number 2 is the most important to me, but we'll start with number 1. So the pineal gland is our spiritual muscle. It is an eyeball. It has a lens. We are able to perceive other vibratory planes with our pineal gland. So we must exercise it and decalcify it. It becomes calcified from fluoride and sugar. And, well, those are the 2 biggest ones. To me, when I started learning this, I started eating, instead of dessert, I'd get like an extra burger, Like I'd rather have all those extra fats and carbs and just take that on my physical body, as opposed to the deep effect of sugar that can have on us. Not all sugar, but processed sugars can be way worse. So there's different ways to decalcify your pineal gland. And drinking clean water is one of the most important, because our whole body is water. So I was listening to this guy talk from India, I believe, and he talks about taking turmeric paste and putting on your forehead at night. And I think this is an intuition-based practice. So if you feel that, he says if you're younger, like if you're maybe 20, do 10 nights on your forehead, and if you're older, do 20 nights in a row on your forehead. I don't know how many I did. I just did it until I felt I didn't need to do it. And I think that's how everything in life should be, is that trust in self and that intuition. Visualization is also an exercise. So when your eyes are closed and you're visualizing that picture, your pineal gland is vibrating. It's creating a vibration that's shaking off this calcification. And it takes work, and I think the turmeric paste helps a lot. But I told one woman about the turmeric paste, and then we did an energy session, and she started asking me, like, what is happening to me? Are these ascension symptoms? Like, why am I perceiving these things? I was like, you signed up for it. Our higher self tracks everything without fault. Everything that's happening to us, everything we experience is intentional. And it's according to law. But we'll get to that. The next slide is actually a bonus slide that no one needs to know. I just think about it all the time. So number 2, grounding and calling back your energy. And to me, this is one of the most powerful practices, again, because feeling other people's emotions, especially as you decalcify and you begin to feel these extrasensory perceptions, like, oh, I know you're feeling this, or are you feeling this? Because that's what I think you're feeling. And we get more in tune with that. So I do this as a visualization as well, and this can take anywhere from a minute to an hour, and there are infinite ways to do this. This is just a suggestion. So again, I start at my higher self and opening up my crown and my higher self, and I usually take some time to open my third eye to my higher self as well. And then I'll start taking these layers. I like doing like a layer of light through my physical body, or start through my pranic tube, or do my aura. There's multiple ways to do it. But start with red light, because red is the color of our root and is the color of grounding. So I take red light and just breathe, just keep breathing and visualizing this layer of light. And the more you do it, the more you learn to feel it, which is fake it till you feel it. You can feel these visualizations within yourself, and just feel this layer of light, and you put intention into the light as well, and you ask your higher self to help you with these things. So I am grounding anyone's energy that no longer serves my highest good. And when you ground someone's energy, there's a couple things I think you should look out for. You want to ground it to the grand central sun in Gaia, in neutral, and so that it returns to the person in neutral form. Because if you remove someone's energy from you and send it back to them, and your energy's on it, then you're kind of defeating the purpose a little bit. So and sometimes I'll do these layer of light, like I said, for an hour, just each breath, just layer of light until I feel light. And I'll do my pranic tube, so through my energetic centers. I'll do my physical body, I'll do my other bodies, and then I'll do my aura. And then step 2 is calling back your energy in neutral form. So I picture a star or a light above my head, and that light is a magnet for all my energy anywhere in the universe. Anything I thought of, anyone I've ran into throughout the day, anybody that, if I have a thought of somebody randomly, I think that they're in my space, and I ground their energy and I call my energy back. So once I'll do that for 5-10 minutes, just feeling this energy build up at my higher self. And then step 3 to me, and you could do this all in one step as well, so is filling yourself in with that energy, with the white light of what you are. And you can visualize the white light of your higher self flowing down through you and to your feet, and then filling you up like a glass of water. Or you could feel it filling up your head and then filling you down, and just play with the different ways. It's really just a game. So again, the energy is conscious, and ask and you shall receive. I'm a very big believer in that. So if I ask this energy to open, balance, and align my energetic centers, then it will. If I want it to clear this person's energy, and if you know you interacted with somebody and they're like, and you can't stop thinking about them, so you had a confrontation, call that person's energy out specifically. Like, I'm grounding this person's energy to the grand central sun with love and forgiveness so it can return to them in neutral form, which I know is a mouthful, and then calling your energy back in neutral form. 7 rays of light. So again, chakras, the colors of a rainbow. I'll start at my higher self with a red light coming down my pranic tube, connecting to my root, so it's a perfect red light, and just keep breathing in that color red to my root and grounding, and then until that light is solid. And then I'll go to my next chakra, so bring in the color orange to my sacral, which has a front and back, and then I'll blast it out the front and back of my sacral until it's functioning fully and both are balanced, and going through each color like that. Number 4 is super beneficial for self-confidence and in your pineal gland and your visualization. So what I'll do is I like to do it, breathe into my lungs, but you could breathe into the chakra as well. So I'll breathe in the color red, and I'll fill my lungs up, and this vibrant, brilliant color red that comes into my lungs will absorb all the stagnant energy in my root chakra. And then I'll observe the color that comes out with my eyes closed. And a lot of times it can come out black or muddy, and you just keep breathing in that color in and out until it comes out the pure color that you breathe in. Does that make sense? I really enjoy that one. And again, just going through each color of the chakras. Muscle testing to me has been very beneficial for me connecting to my higher self, and that belief that I can connect to my higher self, because it's a physical connection, the most dense level of our being. So there's many ways to do it. Some people do a finger questions, but I stand, so feet square, hands over my heart, take a few breaths to ground out, and then I ask the frequency of my higher self to come in as I ask a question. And I say, like, maybe I want to eat nachos, and I'm like, will this benefit me? And if it's a no, I'll get pulled backwards. And if it's a yes, I get pulled forwards, like that will benefit me. And the more you do this, the more you solidify the connection. But sometimes I'll get like, will coffee benefit me? No. And then I'll be like, well, will it harm me? And I'll get a yes, and I'll be like, I still want coffee, man. And it's okay to not listen. You just have to face the repercussions of that, whatever they may be. Any questions on those? Okay. Bonus slides. This comes from Dolores Cannon, from her book, The Convoluted Universe. So she started with UFO abductions, then went to past life regression. And in her books, she brings forward these personalities who are living in these other timelines to talk about the timeline in which they live. She has a lot of books out. And I consider her the mother to my spirituality, and I consider Drunvalo Melchizedek the father to my spirituality. And it took a lot of research on both sides to really balance out as much as I have. So this being that she's channeling talks about that when we're born in this universe, we're born in several. So if we looked at like the universe is just a sphere, because the whole reality is contained within a sphere, say there's like 4 of them, and we were born in each of them. And then every time that we come into a decision, so we make decisions all the time, and even if you decide not to make a decision, that is a decision. So we're always making decisions. And every time you come to a choice, A or B, potential energy has been created for both, and potential energy must be fulfilled. So say version of me comes to, I gotta pick A or B, and I pick A. Well, a version of me, another interpretation of the reality, another timeline, is created of version B. So now there are 2 timelines of me existing, and this happens at every single decision. Now, every single version of us also has free will. So if version A and B come to decision C or D, both of them can choose C. But potential energy was created for D, so now there's another timeline of decision D. And that's how I look at the multiverse theory. So a man named Bashar does channelings. In one of them, he talks about every single moment we are changing dimensions. And to me, the only thing that exists is the moment. Everything else is just a projection. So when I hear that we're changing moments in every moment, or changing dimensions in every moment, I think that the timeline that I'm creating a decision to line up with has to karmically, and by the law of the Hermetic principles, has to line up with the exact timeline of my past decisions, so that very unique past life, that the decisions line up with all the laws and karma of the decision I just made. So that's how I look at the infinite reality of that we exist in. And our higher self tracks all of these without fault. So nothing is lost. It's all part of our lessons. And that's the whole thing. And this is some resources. The Hermetic principles come from the second one, the Kybalion. It's a really short book written by 3 initiates. Convoluted Universe by Dolores Cannon, that's the one that I was just describing about, that information. And she talks about, they ask all sorts of things about Sasquatch and Easter Island heads and a bunch of other stuff. It's really super interesting. And then the movie by Nassim Haramein, third one from the bottom, Black Hole. If that's some serious left brain material that I watched no less than 6 times and took notes every time and had to take a nap. So much information. And last December, I made a video called Energy and Music, which goes through the harmonics of music and how it correlates to our reality, but it does it in an informational manner. So it's a camera over a paper, and I'm just going through a bunch of notes trying to teach people stuff. So that's some left brain material too.
What form of Reiki do you practice?
I don't.
You don't?
Well, I mean, I do practice energy work, but as far as Reiki, it's to me an avenue for practice. So
Right.
I studied Reiki level 1 on YouTube at the beginning of this, and a bunch of other energy avenues. So the reason I quit my job, because I was a government contractor after I got out working on the same psych unit. I quit my job because of 3 people I worked with. they asked me, the first guy was a psych nurse that we had literally been in fights with patients before. He'd been in psych nursing for 20 some years and big into politics, doesn't believe in Eastern medicine, but he trusted me. And trust seems to play a big part in this, and it can. So he had an ACL replacement 20 years, so like 21 years ago now. So 20 years when I was working with him. And he was 50, he got told his cholesterol was high, started working out, hurt his knee, and then we worked opposite schedules, so by the time I saw him, it was day 10 of this injury, and he had hurt his shoulder as well, and it was day 4 of his right shoulder injury. I had heard that people who do metaphysical events will time like $1 a minute or something like that. And we were on the psych unit, and he was limping. He was like, dude, can you please help me? And he doesn't even believe in it. So I had just gotten back from Colorado, the class here, and we go into an office on the unit, and I start on his shoulder, and I'm like, I'm going to do 10 minutes and just channel energy and see what happens, because that's all I'm doing is channeling energy after I connect to their higher self. 2 times during it, he was sitting like this, and he's like, I don't know what you just did, but I just felt electricity shoot down my arm, out my hand, and down my leg, out my foot. And then after 10 minutes, I take my hands off. I'm like, how's it feel? And I'm sitting behind him, and he goes, it doesn't hurt. I was like, are you serious? And he was like, would I be shitting you? Like, he was freaked out. So then I go on his knee, and because it was an older injury, I spent 20 minutes. And he said during that time, like I was doing hand placements, and he said my hands would get super hot as soon as I would put them on, and he would feel them heat up, and then I'd move to another spot. By the time my hands got to the next spot, they'd be cooled off, they'd heat up again, but the spot they left would stay hot. And he also felt electricity shooting out his knee. After 20 minutes, his pain totally went away, and he had surgery scheduled for the next week, and he didn't get surgery. So we walked back on the psych unit, and people are like, why are you guys acting so weird? And I refused to say I healed him, so I wouldn't say a word. And he didn't know what to say to anybody because he didn't believe this worked. So then these blocks that I talk about can go through the energetic bodies as well. So another woman I worked with, who's one of the only people who really believed in me as I started seeming to go absolutely crazy, through this. She had dropped like a book between the tendons on her foot, and then on her other foot, she dropped a box on the tendons, which was interesting because I learned Edgar Cayce, nothing happens, accident or injury in our physical body unless it's connected to our other bodies, like it's a sign for us. So I still love her very much, and I worked on each foot on the unit for 15 minutes, and then she didn't say anything, and I don't ask, because if the need to ask for validation comes from the ego, and that you have to let that go. So I didn't say anything. A couple weeks later, I'm at work, she calls me in the office, she's like, hey, and she's been in nursing like so long that she didn't have a nursing degree. She started before they needed degrees. Yeah, and total badass woman. I love her so much. So she had been through so much trauma and the depression and a bunch of other stuff, and abusive husbands, losing her children. So she said she never really worked through those things. She compartmentalized them. And she started having dreams of like us in a car, and the moonroof would open and a white light would go out and a blue light would come in. And then she had this dream of an all-white house. And all the windows were painted white and it was pristine, except in the house there was one room that was dark and dirty and cobwebs and full of boxes. And in her dream, she began going through those boxes and like opening them and going through, and the box would just disappear. And she was progressing through all these traumas that she refused to address. And that was the energy working through the emotional body on the physical injury.
Emptying the file drawer.
Yeah. And Edgar Cayce also talks about he has presentations on his work. And one of the presentation talks about in your dreams, if you see a house, that house may represent your body. And the presenter says, if I see a leak in my dream in the house, I know something's wrong in my body. And I also think practicing, working with your dreams and creating the subconscious to make, because your subconscious can actually become completely conscious. And we can be what is called supra-conscious. Anyways, that's dreams. But the third one was a military nurse, and she had a headache. and she kind of believed in spirituality. I think she practiced some stuff, go to metaphysical stores, but she was a army nurse and my boss. And she comes into work and said she had a headache for I don't know how long. And I was like, well, I've never worked on a headache, but I'll try it. So again, we're on the psych unit, which is like the least conducive healing environment on that level. But so I started on her head, and in like 10 minutes, she said her headache went away. So I was like, cool. So I put my hands on her shoulders and I started grounding her. She ended up getting out, running to the bathroom after a few minutes. And she came back and she was like, when you put your hands on me, I felt myself like a layer of electricity filling me down. And I was cleansing her chakra system. And then she said nausea came up. She ran in the bathroom and she hadn't eaten. She puked up some black tar. And then she started sleeping again. So whatever the block was is physical energy, and it needed to come out in that manner. And then that was like a Thursday, and I saw her again that Monday. She ended up puking again some more and sleeping even better. And that's when I decided, like, yeah, I'm definitely quitting this, teaching people how to, I want to teach people how to heal themselves. Because no one can actually do it for us. We can get assistance, but, so that's the energy work I do.